Hey, international educators, are you ready for the day when you go unglobal? We decided once again to gaze into our crystal ball, this time to learn about transitioning out of international education. Fortunately, our all-star panel of Amy Hunt, David Ross, and Rob Howe were ready once again to share their experiences to answer our guiding question, focusing on lessons learned in leaving international education. Get ready for a lot of anecdotes, strategies, and how-tos to help you plan for the day when you return to life in your home country. You probably are familiar with Amy, David, and Rob from episode 66, but do take a look at the show notes for their full bios. Amy worked at several international schools, opening doors along the way to teaching a variety of subjects while also pursuing studies in yoga and yoga therapy. Amy provides insights on making transitions, building in time for reflection, especially for self-understanding regarding how living internationally brings new cultures into one's life. Amy is also our voice on what teaching in the U.S. can encompass. David worked at 2 international schools for extended periods. As a musician and athlete, he finds ways to connect with others through both hobbies. David is also becoming our finance guy, sharing thoughts on retirement planning and healthcare in the U.S. David is in full retirement, making Los Angeles his home, where he, his brother, and son share a house with David's mother, providing care for her. Rob also worked at several international schools that he describes as very community-focused. He's our business guy, having twice returned to the U.S. to switch out of education into the business world. Rob shares experiences of parenting high schoolers who have made the shift to U.S. public schools. He also brings that outside of education perspective to remind us all of how fortunate we are having taught in international schools. This show was recorded on January 15th, 2025. Get ready to learn how your many years of international teaching experience naturally prepares you for the exit ramp from international education.
How wonderful is this? We have our group of 3 veteran educators back with us again to share more insights. This time, we're going to be kind of looking at going unglobal. But first, if we could welcome everybody and ask where in the world they are. How about we start with you, Dave?
Well, I'm in the wonderful vacation land of Thailand. Glad to see everybody.
Woohoo! And you're in the probably warmest place of any of us. How about you, David?
David, I am in Southern California, Orange County, actually.
But you're far enough away from the fires not to yet be running out the door.
That is correct. I'm about an hour south of the fires, and we haven't had any problems here, luckily.
Thank goodness.
Yeah.
And how about you, Rob?
I'm in Tucson, Arizona.
Very nice. And Miss Amy?
I am in the Bay Area on the peninsula just south of San Francisco.
Wonderful. And I am in Kathmandu, Nepal. So early morning for me and pretty early for Dave and late afternoon, evening for y'all. That's great. So let's start with, as I said, a short going kind of unglobal story, because our theme of this show is repatriating or pivoting out of international education and moving back to your home country. So who would like to start with their going unglobal story?
I'll start. So I'm David, and I'll talk a little bit about transitioning out of international teaching, meaning transitioning into not working, which definitely has its challenges, but also its definite rewards. So one of the big challenges for me, and I kind of saw this coming before I left international teaching, was losing my tribe, and I'm using air quotes, my tribe, my group of friends, which can be rather large in an international community, which is wonderful, and creating another tribe when I got to my new location, which would be here in Southern California. I am a firm believer that most everybody, if not everybody, really needs a tribe, however big or small, but your tribe is your family and friends that you pick and that you choose to spend your time with. And it took me a while. It took months to build a tribe here. And I'll go into more detail about that later. So that was one challenge. And also navigating, in my case, the frustrating and complicated, expensive US medical care system. Coming from international teaching with this wonderful global medical care system, which there was no deductible and no copays, and we could go anywhere in the world. And so I had to come back to the US and deal with the US medical care system. And luckily, I managed to do it in the last couple of years. I'm getting much better at it. And the last challenge was to create purposeful and meaningful and healthy activity for my day-to-day life, which seems to kind of fit in place a lot easier when I was working overseas. And once I left, I realized it was all up to me. And over the last 2 years, I'm happy to say I've done pretty well. I have found a groove, but it does take a little while, and it's pretty neat now. So that's my going unglobal little synopsis.
Amy.
Yeah, so that idea of things taking about 2 years really resonated with me. I had moved back to the US one time before, just before my first son was born. I moved from Rio back to the US while my husband was going to get his PhD. And we ended up staying in the US for a while and having 3 kids before going abroad again. And so in that time, I had faced moving back to the US after having been gone for 10 years. And it took about 2 years to really sort of get on my feet and to feel like I was myself again in this new context. And I would say in this move that I just made a couple of years ago back to the US, a really similar thing happened in that it's taken about 2 years, but what has emerged on the other side is actually a lot better, richer, fuller than what I had left, which was a really big surprise. So when I transitioned out of international education, I knew that at some point I would retire, but my partner and I, who were at the same school, we were not planning on leaving. We weren't planning on leaving really ever. We were planning on staying at that European school in Brussels until we retired. And there was just a lot of issues with our life there, some family stuff, but also professional stuff, particularly with his job, that got us looking sort of quickly for something else because it was kind of getting untenable. And an opportunity came up in the US, which we had not ever considered. We hadn't even talked about moving back to the US. And we were a year away from getting EU citizenship for us and all of our kids. And it just wasn't in the cards. And then it was like, wow. And it showed up in a really interesting way, which was an opportunity that the more we looked at it, the more it was actually a perfect fit for us. Personally, professionally, like it was just magic dust somehow landed on us. And it was great. But it all happened right at the beginning of the pandemic. My daughter was a senior and IB exams were really up in the air. Nobody knew what was going to happen, if schools were going to open, how were we going to make a move during the pandemic? Like, how were we going to move our pets? And the airport was closed, So it was a lot of stuff that was really, really, really bumpy. And in the process, I was so, I'm a yoga teacher and a yoga therapist, and I teach these things. And yet I didn't realize I was so disembodied that I just tripped over something stupid and broke my foot. I've never broken a bone in my whole life. And it was it made so much sense to me in this like obvious moment of Amy, pay attention to what you're doing. So, it's the pandemic. We're leaving suddenly. IB exams are canceled. I have a broken foot. It's just a perfect storm of crap. And it threw us off, but it didn't throw us off nearly as much as I thought maybe it would, or that maybe it should have, or it might have. And I don't have any other explanation than that all those years of navigating the complexity of living internationally, right? Operating in languages that I can only understand 30% of and not knowing how to do anything and just feeling like an alien all the time. I think that really prepared us for a sideswipe that we weren't expecting. And we landed on our feet, and it's been actually an amazing opportunity. I liken it to that metaphor of I could never have seen this from where I was in Brussels. But once we walked through that door, not completely of our own will, there were all these other doors. But I never would have known that they were even there until I actually went through that door. So the transition has really been something, but I'm really glad that we did it. And I'm glad that I'm here.
Nice.
So I'm glad to hear you landed on your feet, but it sure must have been painful with a broken ankle.
Too,
Well,
too
All
much,
right.
too much weight to carry.
All right, Rob, off you go.
Wow. Okay. Well, it's always cool being last because you get to hear what people are saying, what experiences they've had. So I actually, Amy, had a very similar experience. My first experience with my wife was overseas in Indonesia, which, by the way, talk about a small world. David Ross and his wife had applied at the same school several years later, and we think it was right when we left and that
That's
they were
crazy.
going to be filling those spots. Anyway, so we left Indonesia without kids and decided to return to the US after 2 years to start a family. And there were all kinds of things we gave up, our tribe, this whole process. I was going to go to University of Michigan, get my master's, do all of this kind of stuff. And I ended up starting a career in sustainability. And as Amy said, we had no tribe and our goal was to start a family, but that took time. So all we did was we moved to this new town. My family was kind of in the area, but we didn't know anybody. And so I started getting into local politics and starting all of these green organizations. And we ended up staying for 8 years. And we adopted 2 kids. Again, wasn't what we were thinking, and decided to return overseas. So we did give up kind of that path we thought we were going on, but landed on our feet, made all kinds of lifelong friends. And when we decided to go back overseas, we wanted all of those perks that we didn't have in the US. The vacation, the exotic places, those challenges Amy's talking about, which I'll refer to again. So when we returned overseas, we landed in Lebanon. And in each of the countries that we went to after that, all kinds of adventures, we could almost say chaos in some cases, but this theme of becoming resilient and needing to be agile positioned us so well for returning to Arizona. And just like Amy's situation, we were faced with lockdown number 3. Our son was going to be a freshman in high school, and we didn't really know if it was the right thing to do to stay in Vietnam. And so we opted to return to the US thinking that we'd have a little more stability, but having that resilient needing to do something new bug. I'm from Boston originally. We didn't return to Boston. We returned to Arizona where we didn't know anyone. Climate was different and we didn't have jobs, nothing. And so we landed and we lost a lot of stuff. We lost the peeps of the community. We lost the path we thought we were going on. And oh, by the way, we needed to acquire a lot of things. We didn't have cars. We didn't have any appliances. We didn't have anything. We did have dogs, but that's about it. So I would say that, the theme of resilience is really what gets you through, and you really learn that. You may not even realize that you are, but every time that you move and you make these massive transitions, most people only do one of the 3 things you're doing. They change a job or they move. They move to a new place or they change or do something with their housing. Rarely do people do those 3. And so all of us are doing that every time we go to a new school, new job, new house, new community.
As you jump in, ditto on the resilience thing that Avi brought up and now Rob. And I heard a really great quote the other day. It's in a movie. It's there are 3 things for sure in life: pain, uncertainty, and constant work. And you know what? It's true. There's no time in life where you can go, oh, okay, finally, all those 3 things are out of my life. No, they're always going to be there.
Yeah, so I was thinking about what you said. I think it's really salient for me, this idea that life is full of change and everybody makes changes. But when you build your life with other people in a country, around an institution, and around a community, when you make the choice to leave, that's all gone, right? And while I think all of us have probably experienced the fact that international schools tend to be really welcoming places and that you can come in with some sort of structure. It's not like you're just landing on the shores of this country with no direction. And people are welcoming and have structures for you and help you with housing or whatever. That sense of palpable loss can still be really overwhelming. And somewhere in my career, I wish I could remember when, maybe between Barcelona and Sao Paulo, perhaps is when this happened. Somebody taught me about RAFT. And I don't know if all of you have thought about RAFT or if you've used the RAFT acronym, but I found it incredibly helpful, not just for me, but for my kids as well. So when you leave a place like an international community, what we're supposed to do is we're supposed to build our raft so that we can safely float away into our new place, right? I'll just say them and then I'll tell you what I think they mean. The R stands for reconciliation. The A is affirmation. The F is farewell. And the T is think destination. So I think that the R has always, until the most recent move, been something really easy. And that is just reconcile yourself to whatever it was that didn't get finished, relationships that need to be dealt with, administrators, maybe that you didn't get along with, just whatever reconciliation means to the country, perhaps. Sometimes I know that one partner in a teaching couple is happy to go and the other one isn't happy to go, right? So whatever that sort of thing is that you don't want to take with you, getting yourself to the place where you can leave that behind, I think is really important. And the affirmation is really being explicit about what you've gained from living in that place, what your colleagues have offered you, what you've learned professionally from opportunities you were given, doing all of that, like seeing that place you've been with fresh eyes one last time with gratitude, I think is really important. And then the F is, for those of us like me who might be more apt to take the French exit, out the back door and not do all of the goodbyes because it's a lot of emotional work. It's really important to do the goodbyes and do them right. And especially as you get older in your career, like not pretend that you're probably ever going to see them again. Some people you will, but some people you really need to say goodbye to. And I think that was something that I learned how to do over the years. And then the last one is think destination, right? Having the opportunity in this mix as well. Like, what am I going to do when I get there? What might I learn? What am I excited about? And like I said, doing that with the children, moving from place to place, them all having their own little rafts as well, I think was really helpful for them for transitioning from place to place.
I like that. Good points.
I do too. And the positive psychology dweeb that I am, I just love positive psychology. So I'm glad to see someone else bringing an acronym into the discussion. What jumped out at me was the R, the whole idea. And I haven't really heard that before because we leave with regrets, as you're saying, and potential spots of a bit of anger. And especially as the loss comes in, not just of the good, but the things we struggled with. So that's kind of one I would want to put out to leaders of school to say, wow, that's a hot topic. How can you build in structures for people to be able to have those deep conversations, often with administrators, right? To work things through. So that's a huge takeaway for folks. So think about bringing that into your practice as much as you can. So let's just repeat our guiding question. Audrey brought it up, but the official one is, what are some of your takeaways and advice from transitioning out of international teaching? And we're really going to go with a flow process, jumping in and out, people sharing their stories. So why don't we continue on the Going Global stories, talking about your personal and professional experiences leaving international education. And we're touching on a bit of the stages of loss and change as you start your new lives. Who would like to continue telling some stories? Rob?
Okay. No, happy to. Yeah, I mean, it's a tough thing to transition, particularly when you're not prepared and it's not that linear path that you may have planned for initially. In our case, I'm dealing with this now. If you work in a corporate job in the United States, you are guaranteed a 3-week vacation. And one of the main reasons that I loved our overseas life was 14 weeks, and I could count them, 14 weeks of vacation a year, which for us was a whole lifestyle that was absolutely incredible. And unfortunately, most Americans in the corporate world are conditioned. After 5 years, you get another week off, so you get 4 weeks a year. We're talking about 4 weeks of vacation per year. That's it. And that doesn't include your weekends and a couple of federal holidays thrown in. And so that is a massive loss from my perspective. I'd argue that that's the biggest loss. That's a quality of life thing. And then secondly, transitioning out of teaching, which is very group-centric. You're focused really on interacting and caring and nurturing for families and for their kids. Being in a business is very different. The objective is to make money and to be profitable and obviously serve clients, which there are a lot of very positive things about that. But the outcome is showing profit. And so, again, loss on, I would argue, the quality of the engagement, let's say, of mentoring students and following all of that curiosity that is so inclusive in the educational experience of just being in a school community. In business, there's certainly learning to be had, but it's learning about clients' needs and learning about where opportunities are. And I'm in the consulting world now. And so I work with a lot of different companies. That's very interesting in different ways. But again, that spark of curiosity doesn't allow you to go down those rabbit holes that you could do in a classroom where a lot of that learning really happens. So those, I'd say, are two very big losses. And then I would argue, too, there are other obvious ones like the healthcare David talked about. Healthcare is much more expensive in the United States, and I would argue not as person-friendly. Health insurance companies are very happy with the plan, but I'm not very happy with them. And I guess last point is, looking at cost of living is actually substantially higher in this country and obviously in Europe particularly.
I just want to say that what you're doing right now is encouraging people who are in the business world to become teachers and go international.
Oh, my goodness. What a concept. Yeah.
Plug there.
Plug.
Yeah, so I was going to jump in on that a little bit. It's funny because what you're saying resonates with me, and yet I left my job, but I'm still teaching. And my actual day-to-day life is not very different from the life that I was living as a teacher when I was living in Brussels. But I think that what has made this transition so great is that we took a chance on a place that didn't, on the surface, look like the places we had been, right? Which were really good international schools where I was an IB teacher in 3 subject areas and I was an examiner. And I was sort of at the top of that game after 30 years. And we had lots of opportunities when we were leaving, but we looked at something that wasn't such an obvious fit, like you're saying, leaving teaching and starting a consulting business, but being able to see an opportunity for what it is, I think really helped. Like if we were going to leave and if we were going to make a big change and if it was the pandemic and if we were already doing a 180 in terms of a change in trajectory, sort of leaning into our history as risk takers, we saw something and we ended up at this funky school in the Bay Area, which is actually a perfect fit for us. It couldn't be a better fit, but not something that I would have seen. And I think this is something that maybe we talked about a little bit in the last episode, but I think all 3 of us said, pick up as many skills as you can along the way, have as many volunteer opportunities, because you never know how you're going to leverage those skills later. I had no idea that there was such a class called social emotional learning for high school students. Our school is one of the only schools in the country that does it. We call it science of mind. And my whole history as a psychology and philosophy TOK teacher and all of my yoga therapy training came together. And that's not the job I applied for. It didn't exist. It just happened. And it's like that trust that you have skills, even if they're not easily explainable to people who haven't been in international education. we all have skills. We have this weird set of experiences that we can translate into something very real in another context. And I found you can't imagine at age 62 how gratifying it feels to be doing something brand new within the world of education. It's just amazing.
All right, I'll jump in. So we just interviewed Leanne Lavender, who is a consultant, and it's going to be a super show we're going to share in several weeks. Her story was similar to yours, Amy, that they were in China and COVID hit. And like some people, they were able to leave. And then, to use your terminology, they landed on their feet as well in Canada. And she switched from being a teacher to being a consultant. So that's just a huge lesson, as we're saying. It's kind of natural for us as risk takers, lifelong learners, to keep building the skill base, trying new jobs. And then, as a couple of you are saying, being ready for the unexpected and then looking at several options, I think is so huge. And one of the themes I'm hearing are some of the character strengths. Like Rob, you were saying about creativity. There's so many character strengths that we have. Some that we've used a lot in our teaching experience, international life, others that aren't as exercised, but we can exercise them anew. And I'm going to speak a little bit more about PERMA, but that's my 2 cents adding to what you were saying there, Amy.
So unlike Amy and Rob, you guys are working. And as a buddy of mine says, you guys are help rowing the boat in America, whereas I'm not rowing the boat anymore. So I'm not working. But I wanted to talk a little bit about like preparing for when you get to the point where you're not working and you need passive income. And Audrey and David, didn't you guys have Andrew Hallam on your show before?
We did.
Yeah. And so he came to our school in Vietnam years ago. It was before David, it was before you were there or Rob. And he came and spoke. Andrew Hallam, for your listeners, he wrote Millionaire Teacher. Basically, he wrote about how to be an international school teacher and save, because often one does not pay into their country's retirement system when they're abroad. And that's something that I think a lot of teachers overlook. Anyway, I think there are about, 70 to 100 teachers in the auditorium there. And he was explaining about the compound interest calculator and how, you should be taking 15 or so % of your income and investing it and all that. And after he kind of educated us. Oh, and he also talked about, by the time you retire, by the time you're this age, you'll want to have this much in your nest egg. And he goes, how many people, a show of hands, are on track to hit that mark? And I think 1 person out of 100 raised their hand. And so that really made me think, okay, I got to kick things into high gear. And I think it probably did for a lot of other people too. So I wanted to focus a bit on saving for retirement as an international school teacher. And I know your listeners are probably from all over the world, but I think in general, if you're overseas working and you're not paying into a company that is based out of your own home country, I don't think generally they're not paying into any kind of retirement system. So I'm American, so I did not pay into the Social Security pot. So I won't get Social Security as a retired person. So I had to look out for myself to have passive retirement income. And I just want to stress and encourage all those teachers out there who are maybe starting out or maybe early on to really look into that, get a good financial person, and live well into your means. Live within your means. I saw so many of my friends would just get that big paycheck. And often in international schools, those paychecks can be pretty big. And you're living in a country that's cheap and spend, and they didn't pay themselves first and save it for later on. So live within your means, but still have fun, and look into, investing 15, 20% or even more, and invest it into safe, steady growth things like ETFs or index funds, mutual funds, not the high risk stuff. That's what Andrew Hallam would say, I believe. Or maybe if you're able to have an investment property in your home country that you could rent out or have as a home when you go back. So you won't have to pay for rent. So look out, pay yourself first, and be ready to be building up your retirement income in the event you're not going to get any pension or very little pension when you return to your home country.
I'm just going to jump in and say that Andrew would not say the part about get a financial advisor unless you really feel like you need one. He would say go rogue and you can figure it out for yourself. But I know a lot of people feel like they should have one. So just be careful. How much are you paying that person?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Thanks for that. I've had one, but he's a pretty dear friend. And Roxanne and I, my spouse and I, we had one for 35 years and he's been our friend. So we knew he wasn't going to lead us astray. And you're right. You want to go with fee only people, not people who work on commission. And if you are going to go and do it on your own, yeah, just do your research. Would you agree with that, Audrey?
Yeah, that's what I was trying to say.
Yeah, yeah. It's a really good point there. Yeah, because you can spend a lot of money on advisors. Amy, what's
Yeah, I was going to, that's funny because Audrey and I both jumped in on that same point about the financial advisor. My husband is quite capable at such things. I tend to leave all of the thinking about our money to him and do a lot of nodding and saying, yeah, that sounds good. Let's do that. But once our lives got more complicated, and that was when he became an administrator and eventually a head of school, we had a lot more money in retirement programs that were in different countries. So we would have a bunch of money being held by the Brazilian government, for example. And we have a bunch of money and his whole retirement plan as being a much higher earner than I am with the Belgian government. And sometimes we could dip in and take some, depending, but we'd have to appeal to the government. And we also had 3 college tuitions to pay for at some point. And when we would make a move, we would suddenly be in a situation where half the year was spent in one country with a high salary, half the year was spent in another country, and we had investments in the US that we had to pay tax on. And it started to get to be way more than we could do well. And I mean, I think it broke my husband's heart, but we really needed to have a financial planner, somebody who was watching all this stuff, who would look at the laws, who would optimize it, who would keep track of rates in different countries and exchange rates, and who would ask us questions that we wouldn't have thought to ask ourselves to try to maximize and not lose things, not pay too much tax in one country. Because, taxes in Belgium are 55 to 58%, right? Plus we were paying on US investments. Plus we still had money in Brazil. So it got really complicated. And so I think while I like the idea of being able to do it on your own without a financial planner, if we had had a different kind of life, I think that would have been really possible. But for us, we got somebody early, also a friend, somebody from my high school that we've had now for 30 years. And that's worked out really, really well. We really trust them and they've done us well. And then the other thing that you said, David, is something that we didn't plan to do, but in retrospect, we did it. And it ended up being really smart, which was in the time that we were living in Minneapolis, when my husband moved back to do the PhD, rates were really low and houses in Minneapolis aren't really very expensive. And he was working part-time at a consulting company and I was teaching, and we were able to buy a house. And we spent $200,000 on that house. And it's worth way more than that now. And
I say 200,000? That's cheap.
Yeah, it was so cheap. And it's a nice house and it's right outside Minneapolis. And what happened was that we got in with a home management company, a guy who would just put new people that were coming to Minneapolis to work for Cargill and put them into our house. And we kept the rent really reasonable. So, in the more than 25 years that we've rented out our house, we only had 1 month where we didn't have a renter in there. And that rent covered the mortgage every time. And in October, we paid off the rest of the house, right? I guess what I would want to stress to some listeners is everything that you were saying, which is that you don't have to do a ton. And when you have time on your side by starting young, all of a sudden, my husband and I are now in the position where all of this stuff that we did is paying off, right? Paying ourselves. And we did buy a property in the US that now we own outright. So that feels really safe to have a place that, no matter what happens with the economy, and I don't have much Social Security either because I haven't paid in, but, I can live in my paid off house and eat peanut butter and jelly sandwiches if I have to into my old age.
Just a quick clarification too, again, about Andrew. I think what we're talking about is more of a sort of a tax advisor. And I think that's a great idea. And I think you do need someone for that type of stuff because it is complicated with overseas. And we have a tax advisor and she has saved us hundreds and thousands of dollars over the years. It's more the investing advisor that maybe consider trying to invest as much as you can on your own and do the research and so on and so on.
Yeah, it's a good point. I don't want to misquote Andrew Hallam, so thanks for chiming in on that. And I wanted to add to Amy what you're saying about how you had retirement accounts in other countries. And I failed to mention that because we had a really nice retirement in Malaysia. The Malaysian retirement system was actually really good. And so we paid into that So there is that too, but I guess just stay on top of it, listeners, especially the younger you are, the more you have time on your side. But yeah, pay attention to your finances so it'll be there for you later on in life when you need it.
That's such an interesting wrinkle, paying into the local country pension, and then how to roll that out at some point potentially in a non-taxable way. And back to the point of working with a tax consultant, an international one just seems to make a lot of sense. So I wanted to chime in. In a bit, I'll talk more about living the nomadic lifestyle. But when you make the break from being international, it offers that opportunity, as David was saying, all the three things that are prevalent in our lives, but you do get the time. And what I did to share is I made a trip of a lifetime with my eldest son, not Max, the physics teaching man, but Sam, the outdoors man. And so he wanted to leave the Washington, D.C. area and live out west someplace. So we did a 2-month trip going out west, really not California so much, to explore, go to national parks, support his desire to become a fly fisherman, and he was already a hunter. So be ready for that opportunity too, even if you're going to do like Rob, where you're going to come back and you're going to either start a job, maybe to give yourself some time to say, not only are we going to have a certain experience, but we're also going to give ourselves time to process. And I did want to chime in on the sharing of the 2-year processing time. That really rings true for me as well. Once I left, I think that's part of the loss and change process. And I wanted to mention one more thing. I think we said in the first show together, and we've hit on it a little bit, was you're losing your identity. Amy, not so much, but the rest of us, who we were in a lot of ways is what we did during our 8 till 3 o'clock every day. We were teachers, and the idea of having that tribe, and so much is being written right now about loneliness and people disconnected. And as Rob was saying, the idea that we walk in every day and we've just got all these smiling faces and people who are there to support us, validate us. What a world we're so lucky to have been. And, so, Amy's still being an educator. I throw that into the discussion as well.
So I'm just going to share that we did go back to the States for a year. I did my master's and I had a wonderful year because I had my master's people tribe and very busy. And my husband worked as a teacher in a local school and had a very challenging year, and it was freezing because it was Vermont and so on. But then we went back overseas, and especially for my kids, we're going to talk about families in a minute. It was such a welcome home feeling for them to get back into that community. And then this transition, this most recent, we were back in the States and supposedly retired, but somehow we ended up back overseas. Like it's just the draw is just too strong. And so here we are.
Yeah, I would second that, Audrey, that I've been saying to all of you that we're here, we're happy. I've bought my little retirement cottage. We have a plan to retire in 5 years, blah, 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 blah. But really, what will happen is that we'll leave here, we'll radically downsize, bring our stuff to our little 1-bedroom retirement cottage on a lake in Minneapolis. And then, one of us is going to get a call that says, can you quickly fill in Harare? And we're going to be like, yep, we're gone. And that's going to be, I'm so excited for the idea that I might be able to go to places short term. That just sounds like a beautiful possibility at age 66, 2 months in Harare or Malaysia or wherever. I'm right behind you, Audrey.
I love it.
Yeah, I was going to chime in too, that once you do this and, that 2-year cycle really is reality. We had a lot of friends that we watched had returned to the US and only lasted 2 years and then left again. And so that, I think that 2-year period, and it's very interesting. Most contracts for teachers are 2 years. And so you have to be making a decision less than 18 months in. Now decisions are in that November, December timeframe of the second year. So you really only have 18 months, that getting settled in period, to make a decision. Do I stay a third year? Do I stay a fourth year? But yeah, that desire to return, I know my wife and I are already thinking that way too, Amy. We want our daughter, of course, to graduate from high school here. but then it's unlimited. Yeah. And you think about where your friends are located and people that you've worked for and all of the countries and places you could go to. I'm all for it.
The world is
The
your
world is your
oyster.
oyster. Totally. And I want to mention one thing. One of the teachers in middle school in Vietnam who I worked with, his wife had retired, but could take 2 and 3 month opportunities, like you were referring to, Amy. Schools that have someone that is, let's say, pregnant, and they need an overseas teacher for a 2 to 3 month period. So those opportunities really do exist. They find you temporary housing. They take care of your visa and all of that sort of stuff. But those opportunities are out there for those of you thinking that you don't want to do the whole 2-year thing.
Yeah, we kind of want to do a show about that. So we'll be tapping into those resources to find out more about what that's like, how that works, how do you get into that, and so on.
So we have as you're saying, Audrey, we have 2 or 3 companies, services that do the subbing, and those can lead to longer term stays as well. So as an American who's also dealt with the ACA, we really can't speak to the European countries or the Australians, and I'm not sure about the Canadians there. Audrey, if you haven't been paying taxes in Canada for 25 years, can you return to Canada and enroll in the healthcare system? Do you know?
You have to be there for a while.
You have to be there for a while.
I believe. And you have to start paying taxes into the system before you can sort of rejoin.
I thought so. All right, Dave, what's the rundown on the ACA?
ACA, this took me like a couple months to figure out. That ACA means Affordable Care Act. It's also the same thing as Marketplace, and it's also the same thing as Obamacare. So for your listeners, if you hear any of those, they all mean the same thing. And what it means is financial assistance to help pay for medical care in the U.S., depending on your income level. The lower your income, the more of a subsidy you get from the government to help pay for your medical care. There are many choices. I ended up going with Anthem Blue Cross. And so you find the package you want that fits your needs from whatever insurance company. And then you go to, in my case, it's called Covered California, which is a part of ACA. It's the California part of it. And they say, okay, your income level is this much. We're going to give you X amount to help offset that monthly fee for your medical insurance. Which leads me to another thing is when I went back and finally learned this, I realized that I want to make my income level look as low as possible to the IRS and to ACA so I can get more of a subsidy because health insurance is very expensive. So when I stopped working and came back to the US about 2 years ago, I wanted to come with a sufficient amount of money just in my savings account, quick access savings that I would not have to take out of an investment. Because if I take out of an investment, that's a distribution, and that comes in as income. That makes my income seem higher. So I knew I wanted to have a few years of just living off savings so I could keep my income low and get more of a subsidy for healthcare because it is so expensive. And because of that, I'm happy to say that my monthly premiums for a pretty decent healthcare is very low. So it is possible, but it takes some doing.
Amy, what do you want to share?
I was just going to add another perspective on that because many of the things that you're talking about are exactly what my husband and I have found moving back to the States too, although our circumstances are a little bit different and we're still both working. I think besides having to drive everywhere, which blew my mind coming from Brussels after 6 years, I just didn't drive. And then I'm in Northern California and there's like, okay, there's ostensibly public transportation. But if you've lived in Europe, we can't really call it public transportation, right? Not by what we normally think of. And I imagine parts of Asia are like that too. The driving was a huge thing, but navigating health insurance totally gobsmacked us. It was a language that we simply didn't speak. And I think especially coming from Belgium, where the system is you take your ID card and you put it in the slot when you go to the hospital or the pharmacy or anything, and no money ever changes hands. It's just universal coverage of everything. I don't know how it makes sense to anyone outside of the US, but we still pay a huge amount, even though we're both employed. And about 4 months in, we kind of looked at each other and said, I think it's not a bug. I think it's a feature. And we need to start thinking about this differently. So, David, you were much savvier about it than we were coming in. If we had had more time, again, the move happened unexpectedly. We didn't think we'd be in the US. So we just didn't realize that you have to make complicated choices and be really good at forecasting what you think you're going to need and choose these particular plans that are almost inscrutable to understand. Especially, we had 2 kids in college. And then since then, now they're both out of college and one just turned 26. So he got booted off. So it takes up a big chunk of our time, I would say, is trying to navigate US healthcare. It takes up a lot more time than I ever thought that would occupy in my life.
I just want to jump in and say, thank goodness you broke your ankle in Belgium.
Always looking at the positive, Audrey. That's good. I just wanted to throw in too that the way that we did it was knowing we were leaving. With any organization, you can purchase healthcare as you transition. It's very expensive, of course, when you move back to the US. So you're paying a very large premium and it's pretty good coverage, but you obviously need to get the job. And just to echo what Amy's saying, I mean, even now we have corporate jobs and you are paying out of pocket for a lot of things until hit your deductible. So American healthcare system has got to change. Hopefully it will. But right now you can make that transition. You can purchase 1, 2, 3 months of insurance to transition to wherever you're moving to, if it's the US. But you do want to have some kind of a plan, either if you're in David's scenario or you work with a school, or if you transition to a company, there are programs, but you just have to kind of financially prepare for what you're going to be looking at.
Can I throw in one last thing about this? And this, of course, is more American centric. I know you have a lot of listeners from different countries where they probably don't have to worry about this. But if you are American and you are stateside and you are with the marketplace or ACA system, if your income changes, goes up or down throughout the year, they ask that you tell them right away, hey, my income has gone up an extra $1,000 a month, or it's gone down. Most importantly, if it's gone up, you need to tell them and they will adjust your premium. Otherwise, at the end of the year, if they're not kept up to date with your income, you can be slapped with a pretty hefty fee or paying back a bunch of the subsidy. So I encourage any American listeners to keep the ACA apprised of your exact income level throughout the year.
I just want to say that, again, it feels as though all of your perspectives from healthcare and being in the US are once again a reason for people to consider going overseas, because not only is there better healthcare in general, it feels like the places I've been, and maybe you guys could echo this, I think, you don't always have to have a general practitioner or primary healthcare provider. You can go straight to the specialist and, they say, oh, you need an x-ray. You go get the x-ray like across the street, and then you bring the x-ray back with you and go back and see the doctor, and they tell you the results. So all the waiting for 6 months for an appointment with a specialist, and then having to wait for them to get the x-ray and then make another appointment, et cetera, like a lot of that just goes out the window. In fact, this week I went and saw a doctor and said, I got this prescription when I was in Bangkok and I want to renew it. And he's like, okay, he renews it. And then he hands me the pills. Like, it's just so much more efficient, seemingly, in just about every place we've been.
That is so true. And I'm glad you brought it up, because while I've been overseas, I've had 4 eye surgeries, 2 in each eye. I had double cataract surgery done pretty young in life, around 45. I had that done in Malaysia. It was beautiful. It was great. And then when I was in Vietnam, I got 2 more eye surgeries. It's a long story, but they had to get into my eye and do some stuff. But if anybody thinks that there isn't good healthcare outside of their home country or outside of the US, there is. There's great healthcare. There are great doctors and they can do wonderful things. And I've been very comfortable going to many doctors for surgeries, and not just little stuff, but big stuff. I didn't have to wait. And it was so much easier, like Audrey, like you were saying.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in and just reiterate that I think that thinking about not being able to get healthcare, it keeps a lot of people at home. And the system in Spain and Belgium, I just felt so great to be a part of it because it was so equitable. Everybody had access to everything, and the quality of care was really high. And I loved being a part of that world. I'd also say that I had pretty amazing insurance when I was living in Brazil. And wow, I just wish that every place could be a Brazilian hospital where they greet you and ask you if you want a little coffee and send you to the little lounge, and, a hospital full of Brazilians. That's just like the absolute dream. So I agree. I don't think healthcare should be a reason not to become an international teacher. In fact, the opposite.
I'm just going to say to David's point that as far as being comfortable having stuff happen when you're international, My parents came to see me in Nepal. My mom fell and broke her femur, and turns out she has pretty bad osteoporosis. She was in a Nepali hospital for 3 weeks. We had the best care. And when she got back to Canada, they did an x-ray there and said, yep, they did exactly what we would have done. So, even a place like Nepal, where you may not necessarily expect such amazing healthcare, boy, it was second to none.
That is awesome.
I also want to add a quick little caveat that the schools we've been talking about here, and apparently the schools that many of us were at, had pretty good health coverage. Just be aware that not every school is going to have that level of coverage. Sometimes the school will only cover you within the country and not worldwide. Sometimes there's some coverage, but you have to pay a pretty big deductible and so on. So as David and I are always clear on saying, you have to do your research. If you are looking at a school, look carefully at the health insurance part of the benefit package to make sure you understand how much you'll pay if you pay, where and what kind of coverage you're going to have, what services are covered, and how big is the deductible, are there monthly premiums you have to pay, and so on. So really do your research on that. I just had to say that so that we don't mislead our listeners here. So let's move on then to our next topic, which is thinking about if you have a family in tow. And Amy, I loved your little metaphor of I could just envision your 3 kids floating along on their own little mini rafts. It was adorable. What are some pros and cons that you all have faced with immediate and even extended family in your transition back into your home country?
I'd say that for me, my kids were older when we came back. So my oldest son had already left while we were still overseas and had started college on the East Coast. And then my second son followed. They both graduated from international schools, but then were already in the US while I was still abroad. And then my daughter graduated in that pandemic year that we all left. So their circumstances were slightly different, but I would say that all 3 of them felt very much like imposters in the US in a way that I didn't anticipate and that they didn't anticipate. I was a little bit more prepared for it with the youngest because I had heard the first 2 say it. But when my older son, we were talking about it and he was like, well, I'm trying to figure out how to make friends and, I know people, but I don't really know how Americans talk to one another at my age. And I was like, well, I don't know if I can help you with that. What exactly is the problem? And he's like, you know how in that movie, I don't know, it's like some movie with Will Smith and the aliens and what's that one called? Men in Black, right? It's Men in Black. And there's this time where that one of the aliens is wearing the clothing and the outer skin of Edgar. And he's walking around in an Edgar suit. And my son was like, I feel like I'm an alien in an American suit. And I look like an American and I sound like an American. But I'm not the same as them in ways that I can't quite put my finger on. And when they ask me where I'm from, and he's like, what do you say? And, how do you collapse the whole journey? And he's like, if I say I'm from Minnesota, he said, I got caught out so many times because I've never lived in Minnesota beyond age 6. And they started asking me questions and, 3 sentences in, I'm a complete failure as a Minnesotan. So, your kids probably have felt the same thing. And they did eventually figure it out, let's say after 2 years. In all 3 cases, it was about 2 years before they could translate their humanness into this new sort of form. And in all 3 cases, all 3 of my kids ended up with all the international kids who are from different cultures, who speak different languages, or kids who did IB, or, people who were bicultural in some way is really who all of my friends, and they ended up dating and they've ended up, that's who they're with now is the international kids.
I love the metaphor of the Edgar suit. And I just want to jump into that my 2 kids had completely different experience. My son said, I'm from Vermont because he didn't want to get into it, and then he'd get a little further in. And I think I've shared this before on other episodes, but at some stage he'd say, okay, yes, I grew up in Singapore, basically. And he had kids say, I don't believe you. You're making that up. You just want to sound cool, to the extent that he brought in one of his uniform shirts from Singapore American School. And a kid said, you could have bought that off eBay. Like, there was not just imposter syndrome, but, as soon as he came clean, they didn't believe him. So similar. And then my daughter was at a freshman seminar at Harvard, and you would think that kids there would have a more open, view. And they were talking about socialism and whether it could work. And she was talking about how amazing Singapore was and the social programs and how they've, brought them out of poverty and so on. And people just looked at her like, how could you, rah, rah, USA, and so very different experiences, but she wore it like a chip on her shoulder and he kind of hid it. So there's all kinds of different ways to go, but I loved your metaphor.
I think for both my kids, going into 8th grade, going into 9th grade, pretty challenging. They didn't know anybody, but it was just like the experiences they'd had in each of the schools and countries we'd moved to. And so I would argue that those skills really helped them. I'd say the one huge positive, well, two huge positives. One, the schooling in the U.S. is not as rigorous as the caliber of the schools that we were in. And so my kids are still not returning with homework. They're not doing 3 or 4 hours of homework every night. So they're actually very happy. They're immersed in American culture, which they had not been overseas. The sports programs are incredible, and so the facilities. We're in a public school system. And so a lot of those things are very important to the kids. And so they're actually thriving and doing very well. They've got friends, they're getting driver's licenses and doing well in the sports programs. So the transition initially was very, very hard. But when you get onto a sports team, just like you're a teacher joining a school and you have a group of new teachers you're all starting that new year with, same thing that both of my kids had. And one is graduating this year, and the other one is a junior. So we're almost there.
Yeah, it's great that Rob, your kids, and Amy, your kids, they figured it out, and a little rough at first, but glad that they figured it out. And mine did too. So I have 2 kids, and they both left while we were still in Vietnam. And boy, was that a teary day because we couldn't take them back. We couldn't fly them back home. We had to send them on a plane and lots of tears. But tears of love, they were leaving the nest. But they both Americanized pretty well. I think it was a little rough at the beginning, but yeah, after, 6 months or so, they figured it out. And my son's 22, my daughter is 24. My son ended up finding a really nice gal who's actually Vietnamese. And what's funny is she actually grew up in Saigon, right where we were, and went to another international school right down the street from where our school was. So they were neighbors pretty much for years and never knew it, but they met here in Orange County, California. And so they're doing great. And my daughter, who's now in Arizona, she went straight to Arizona and she stayed there and she's got her own life there and adjusted well. And she's graduated. Oh, and also, yeah, like Rob, you were saying, the international schools prepared my kids really well. And in college, they both have done really well. My son's still in college, but he's getting straight A's. He's doing great. And my daughter, same thing, did really well. And I think they were very well prepared there in Vietnam. I mean, it is a college preparatory school, but I think in general, I think international schools prepare the kids well for when they return home to their home country.
So, D. Ross, if you're up for speaking about parent care, I think your situation's pretty special.
Yeah, I am here helping out my mother. She's 87. And my dad passed away, about 2 years ago. And he did a lot of things around the house, bills and finances and maintenance kind of stuff. So he's here. And also my brother is here. So we're both here kind of stepping in, helping my mom out where needed. And it's good. And we're glad to be here. It's a special time that we never expected to be living back here again with mom in our house that we grew up in.
And that is a reason over the years hearing of fellow educators going back to their home countries to care for their parents. And as we kind of wrap up this one, we'll move into our last section, back to people looking to go overseas and the worries, I'll be away from my family, I'll be away from my friends. And we've spoken about it on other episodes. When you move back, unless you move to your hometown like you did, David, You probably are going to go either where your job takes you or that little cabin in Minnesota there one day for Amy, and you're going to be away from people just like you always are. And we live in a world of video conferencing and WhatsApp and all that. And the old story of, for a lot of us, when we would go back in the summers to our home countries, that's when we'd often get a cottage. People get a cottage house. People come to you. Remember the early part of your career, you're sleeping on everyone's couch as you work your way kind of around the circuit, and then later they start coming to you. So don't let that fear of being away from your friends and family stop you, just like we're talking about the insurance, how good it can be and all the other benefits. So don't let that stop you from going overseas. All right. So what we want to finish up with is just kind of a summation, a lesson learned, a strategy, whatever you want to share as we finish up this very fruitful episode. You all share such helpful information. I'm so appreciative. Who would like to go first?
So I've only taught in 2 international schools, or you guys have taught in between all of you, about 90 different schools. You guys have been around. I'm a little bit jealous. So when we left both schools, my wife and I talked a lot about it, and we both agreed that we wanted to leave on a high note. And I'm glad we did, because I know people, I have friends who taught maybe past their expiration date, and they left kind of not on a high note. And it's like, oh man, I can't wait to get out of here. But we were glad that we did it mindfully, and we left on a high note, and we felt good about it. We felt good about how we were leaving. It's like, things are good, and we want to keep it that way. We want to have that positive memory in our mind of where we were. So I guess I would encourage people to, when you do move on, think about leaving on a high note.
So I was thinking, in coming back to the States, we had a lot of conversations as a family about what are we going to be like now that we're not sort of folding ourselves into another culture. We're folding ourselves back into a culture that, at least for my children, wasn't really even their culture. And I'm from Minnesota, which is maybe a different culture in many ways from my husband's culture, who's from New York. And so sort of like, well, who are we now without this cultural arc sort of over us? And our lives are really hilarious in the sense that I can recognize really clearly where we picked up certain things as a family. That little ritual that happened when we were living in Spain, like we still have a cagatillo, which is the Catalan thing. You whack it and it poops out presents every Christmas. We have a Catalan soup that we eat along with my Norwegian grandmother's lefse and lutefisk. And on New Year's Eve, we are under the table stuffing grapes into our mouth, but wearing white like we did in Brazil and pretending to jump over waves. We just do the weirdest things as a family, and we know where it all came from, especially now that both my second son and my third daughter are living at home for a while, which is also another thing that we picked up. They are not individualistic Americans. Maybe they should be more, but we lived in Latin cultures where it was completely normal to be living with your parents in the household until well into your 30s. My kids, they don't really want to go. Like, we're a unit. We've always been a unit. And now my daughter's Brazilian girlfriend is living with us, found the one Brazilian in Iowa. And my son's girlfriend lives with us. She's from Philly. And for a year, we had an Afghan refugee living with us that we sort of inherited through international school people. And he needed a place to be, and we were trying to help him find an apartment. And it was my kids who said, look, he's hardly getting paid anything. He has to live with us. That's just what we do, right? And I just think we are such profoundly different people, individually and as a unit, because we've been blessed with this range of experiences from all the beautiful countries that we lived in. So even though I'm at the end of my career and we're back in the US, it's totally different from if I had never left. I mean, we are completely different from if we had stayed.
I love that, Amy. That is awesome. And David, I love what you said too. What comes to mind for me is we were at a lot of different schools, and I felt that we maximized our time there. I say that because there's a philosophy of living in the moment, and you never know what's going to happen tomorrow. And I think that we learn that living particularly in developing countries. We were in Zimbabwe when Mugabe was deposed, and it all happened overnight. And we heard the booms from the tanks. It was exciting, and you didn't know what was going to happen the next day. And so I would say, if you are considering moving back to the U.S., it's another chapter in the book. It's not an end, it's a new beginning. And I would argue that you really enjoy that time when you're there. In every country we moved away from, it was hard to say goodbye, but we made the most of it and really traveled and saw what we could and had those final dinners with friends, but didn't end any relationships. It's important to stay in touch with people because you just never know where that door is going to open, and you want to keep doors open. That is very important. If we haven't talked about it enough in today's discussion, very important to have a good relationship with people that you've worked for, people you've worked with. Maybe somebody stays in a certain role or in a school and then they're promoted, and maybe you're interested in going back and they're now your boss. You never know. And so it is very important to leave on a very high note, as David said, to keep those doors open. And, maybe there's something you could do to help people who are looking to transition to the U.S. I actually reconnected with an old colleague from Zimbabwe who's in Wisconsin with his wife. But to Amy's point, too, you really are a changed person after the experience. And I think there's a certain richness of how you look at life that you bring with you and you can share with others. That's all.
And just also sharing that when you're international, I have found, and I imagine that the rest of you have too, people are more alike than they are different when you get to the bottom of what a person has in their heart. And I've always felt that you're enriched by their culture, and also you just gain this perspective that the world is a wonderful place and sharing is caring, if you will take that trite expression. And commonalities far outweigh, I think, the differences. And so becoming, like Amy's talking about, this kind of cultural chameleon is just such a beautiful experience, and it becomes a part of you. And you can't substitute anything else for that.
All right, let's bring everything together. I'm sitting here with such gratitude on your thoughts and wishes for people and important strategies that you've shared. And because I am a positive psychology geek, I am going to put in the show notes my PERMA Pivot Plan, which is a Google Doc that you can copy over. And it's got the whole positive psychology PERMA plan, and you bring in your character strengths and you plan. You look at who you are now, if you're overseas or if you're looking to go overseas, and then who do you want to be next? What do you want to see happen? I think going back to what Dave was saying about the tribes, you're going to start anew. You're probably going to use different character strengths. If you're into PERMA, your engagement, your relationships, your meaning, your accomplishments are going to shift. They're going to change. And I think one of the big lessons here, whether it's financial or back to just the term of your humanity, really be thoughtful, put some planning into it, but be ready to take a leap. That's one of my takeaways from what you all said today, is just ready. Anything can happen. Go for it. You have a toolkit from being overseas that's going to help you in almost any situation. So I share my profound thanks, and I look forward to the next time that we get together.
Thank you from me as well, you guys.
Yeah, it's a blast. It's so interesting and enjoyable talking with all of you. It's great.
Great time. Thank you all.
I've loved it as well. Thank you for inviting me, especially since I'm in the States. It's particularly great to talk to people about international experiences. I encourage everybody to go home and read the poem Ithaca by C.P. Cavafy again, which I'm sure you know. But I think after this conversation especially, it's going to be really, really, really rich when you go back and read that. And maybe you can put it in the notes as well.
We will. All right. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you for joining us today on Educators Going Global.
You can find this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube Music, and all the other usual suspects.
Please subscribe, like us, and leave a review on Apple and Spotify, and let your teaching friends know about us so we can grow our community.
Please reach out at educatorsgoingglobal@gmail.com and join our Facebook group, Educators Going Global, if you have ideas, comments, or wish to share a Going Global story of your own.
You can also find us on Instagram at Educators Going Global.
Please visit our website as well, www.educatorsgoingglobal.com. All our podcast episodes are on there by topic, along with blog posts, Going Global stories, and our ever-growing resource library. For now, this is Audrey
And David.
inviting you to travel
Teach.
and connect with us.